Alright, today I'm going to be testing the AMD Phenom X4 9150E. It is a very large mouthful of a name. Either way, I am pairing this CPU with 4GB of DDR2 RAM. My motherboard only has 2 RAM slots, and it's pretty hard to come by 4GB sticks of DDR2, so we are stuck with 4GB total, or two 2GB sticks. The boot drive and the game drive are SSDs. The graphics card is an RTX 3060. You can see all the specs in CPU-Z and GPU-Z. Alright, without further ado, let's get into the games and benchmarks. Web browsing is alright on this CPU, so let's say you try to open up YouTube. It might take 3 seconds on my i5-13400F, but on this CPU it takes around 8 seconds to load YouTube. Though you can easily watch 1080p YouTube, although the thing is, in my case, I have an RTX 3060 doing the video encoding instead of the CPU, so it makes it a lot easier for the CPU. Either way though, web browsing is alright. It's a bit sluggish. It takes a few extra seconds for every website to load, but that's not too big of a deal. It will load eventually and the website will work just fine. Here are the results for Cinebench R23. They aren't the worst I've seen for a quad-core CPU, but they're the second worst. The worst was the AMD Sempron 3850, which got 578 points, and we got 923 points on the Phenom here, so it's a nice big jump from that, but it doesn't mean it's good. So the first game I'm testing is BattleBit Remastered, and on a 32 versus 32 map, the game was getting 71 frames per second on average. The 1% low was 1 frame per second. Yes, you actually heard that right, it was 1. A single frame in a second. That is horrible. At least the average frame rate was high, but that doesn't mean it was smooth or playable. That average frame rate is pretty deceiving. It wasn't playable. Unless what you count playable is you go over and get shot at and the game freezes for 2 seconds and then you die immediately before you can do anything. The regular old Portal ran really weirdly, so depending where I looked, the game either got extremely good frame rate or alright frame rate. So when I looked some directions, the game was getting, let's say, 180 frames per second. Then I turned the camera slightly and then all of a sudden the game gets 40 to 50. Yes, 180 to 40 to 50. How does that work? I don't know. And that didn't change from the settings either. I tried the low settings and the high settings and the FPS was the same. Some places it was great, some places it was absolutely horrible. Well, okay, horrible comparing the fact that I was just hitting 180. It was still playable all the way through, but not great. Grand Theft Auto 5/GTA 5 was not running very good. It's kind of below the minimum requirements for the game, and at the same time, I can kind of see why. So, the game was getting roughly 30 frames per second on average, but the 1% lows were horrible. The game kept having to stop for multiple seconds at a time and load the map. So, the 1% lows were 1 frame per second, just like BattleBit Remastered. And one of the freezes was actually so big and long it actually crashed the game. I don't know why it crashed the game. That was kind of weird. I've played the game on slower CPUs before and never had that problem, but yep, in this case it crashed the game. Either way, I guess it's kind of playable if you drive around slowly, but if you step on the gas and start moving, the map's not going to load in fast enough and you're going to have big stutters. And if you're trying to, let's say, do some PvP, yeah, good luck with that. Palworld is actually the rather surprising game in the list. So, it is a new game. I didn't expect it to open, and yet it opened. And even more weirdly, it ran somewhat okay. Don't get me wrong, the 1% lows are still horrible. The 1% lows are 2 frames per second. But the average frame rate was 24. Sure, I was at the very low settings, but for context, the Intel Arc A380, when I was live streaming with it, was actually getting roughly this frame rate at the same settings. So this is actually running as good as an Intel Arc A380. Granted, this is with no programs open. If I had, for example, OBS open, I'm sure it would be an absolute slideshow. But I actually consider this very slightly playable, being that I played for 4 hours like this. BeamNG drive was very weird as well. So it has the lowest average frame rate, but the highest 1% lows. It has 1% loads you would expect out of, let's say, an i7-3770. Though, the thing is, I am actually playing on the easiest map in the game to run, besides the absolute flat map. This map at least has some obstacles in it. Either way, yeah, we're getting 15 FPS on average, 14 FPS, I mean. Not the best, far from it. Is it playable? Barely. I could almost get away with it, unless I wanted to play any other map besides this one. Then it would probably get like 5 frames per second. The camera doesn't have any input lag, but the controls on the car does, and the whole game just feels slowed down, and it is pretty unplayable. So, the AMD Phenom X4 that we are testing gave me an SSE error when I tried opening up Halo Infinite, though it did actually open. And on the low settings, I tried to get into a match, and it took so long to load that the game just timed me out and kicked me from the game. And I should also add, when I was trying to open the game up in the first place, it took me over 1 hour. I think the total time was like 1 hour and 7 minutes to open the game. That is a very, very long time. And to save time, I didn't test these games. The reason why is I know for an absolute fact, none of them will open on this CPU. They all require instructions this CPU doesn't have. And I know that this CPU doesn't have the instructions because it has the same instructions as the AMD Phenom X6, which I tested in a previous video, and that failed to open all of these games, and it's actually a faster CPU. So if that CPU fails to open these games, this CPU will for a fact fail to open them as well. Either way, do I recommend you to go out and get this CPU in 2023? No, I don't. And sort of I do at the same time. So what I mean is, if you're just web browsing, this is alright. If you want to play games, maybe try to get yourself a slightly better AMD Phenom, like the AMD Phenom 9850. It is about 1 GHz faster. So if you are actually trying to play games, I really can't recommend getting a AM2, AM2 Plus, or an AM3 CPU. The reason why is they lack instructions and a lot of modern games won't even open. And instead, I recommend looking for maybe an AM3 Plus or an AM4 motherboard, because an FX CPU from AM3 Plus or a Ryzen CPU from AM4 will be much better. Preferably an AM4 Ryzen CPU if you have a choice, but AM3 Plus FX CPUs at least have instructions to open modern games. And for the Intel side, I recommend something like an LGA 1155 motherboard with a cheap Intel Xeon with 4 cores and 8 threads. That will be able to open up pretty much any game out there, though it might not run the game all that well. The same can be said with the FX CPU from AMD. Either way, I hope this video was informative or entertaining or something like that. Either way, thank you so much for watching this video, and I'll see you again next time.